found ordinarily, and trace Lunsford Lane and Pleasant Lane. In my family, as long as I can remember, was this object. And I'd ask different ones, particularly my mother, what this object was or is. And they would say a quill. So while I was in North Carolina, I had the Department of Archives and History to research it. And they came up to tell me that this was once a quill that grew in the marshland along the James River between Virginia and North Carolina around 1750, which means this artifact owned by this woman is older than the United States.
Predated the United States of America.
Predated the United States. Now, how did this happen to be attached to a pipe? And what a coincidence that Lunsford Lane was known as a tobacconist. It is said, as I said earlier, that he is the one that came up with the idea of flavored tobacco. Now, a reed, it looks like this. This is a small reed. This is an older reed. And what people would do during that era was take a reed and cut it to size, then take a corn cob, cut it to size, bake it slowly, and then bore the proper holes, and you had a pipe. The fact that this little object has remained in our family for over 200 years suggests to me to say it to our listeners and to whomever, when you have odd and end artifacts around your house, don't just throw them away. Look into them. This particular artifacts here has more history than a volume of books. It's a matter of following up and researching them and putting the pieces together. There is an old African saying that until a lion tells the story of the hunt, it will always favor the hunter. Until the African American tells his story, it will favor the writers, such as the story of Nat Turner, told in a totally different reference had it been done by perhaps another writer, although it was done by a very successful historian. So this book, Many Roads Travel, has some rich information on plantation archaeology. It has rich information on lifestyle, behaviors, but most of all, as you see in the forefront of that cover, you see a woman and so many millions of others who survived in spite of, who were able to overcome whatever limitations that were presented to them. And as I said to you, Doctor, bondage was not unique to this experience. We remember the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which was the overthrow of serfdom. And serf is a synonym for the word slave. So this book, as the Kirkus Book Review said, is filled with hard truths and is a heartfelt read. Most of all, Pleasant Lane, during those 20 years, never lost her sense of who she was. And she says in the book, my body may have been in bondage, but my mind has always been free. It's a fascinating book, and I think you'll miss something if you do not read Many Roads Travel or 20 Years in Bondage. She is buried in Marshall County, Tennessee at the Clay Hill Cemetery. So she's a part of North Carolina history, Tennessee history, and most of all, American history. So you have any questions?
Well, no, I was thinking, Dr. Young, is there any way that this can be projected in such a way that people can have access to it? I mean, they can have access to the book, but what about some of the images that you have here?
Well, I am pleased to show these at book reviews and gatherings, and if anyone would like to have a book review, and we can get into some of the specificities of the work and its implications to history, excuse me, Southern history, American history, African history, because there's some rich African history there.
I think you already mentioned over the last couple of minutes, why don't you say something about how important it is for Africans to become involved with their own research and their own history? How important is that?
It's absolutely critical. We, not all, but the West African particularly, relied largely on oral history. But oral history is mercurial. And the bearer of the history passes. The history may pass away, or if it was told to someone else, it may change. And the transition very much like the game called gossip. You know, you play gossip, you start at point one, and by the time you get to point 5, it's a different story. But if it's put into a hard surface, a physical surface, it has less likelihood
of being changed.
Of being changed, right. So research, history, appreciate the history. Don't let anybody, for the African American, don't let anybody tell you that you were the only one who was in bondage.
Very good. And of course, Dr. Young, let me thank you over the last minute that we have here for bringing us this excellent information. I think that you've, in a real sense, devoted most of your adult life to looking into the history of the African American, or to the history of America, because I think that what you're talking about now goes back to a period even before we talk about the establishment of the Declaration of Independence, of the Constitution, and et cetera, and et cetera. And for us to know that we were there as well, I think that that's a very, very important contribution that you have made and you're still making. And so let me thank you, and let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.